Welcome to Seduction of the Innocent Part 1, in which we're going to take a look at an almost completely ignored element of psychological manipulation in the comic book industry and related media. In this series, we will examine an almost 80-year-old study from a psychiatrist who warned of the psychological manipulation of children in the 1950s through mass-market comic books, and spawned a Senate subcommittee hearing in parent-organized comic book burnings. We are going to view early comic books as a testing ground for later, larger, more covert forms of psychological abuse and unconscious suggestion of children and young adults, from body shaming to urging psychopathy. We'll unpack the decades of trauma bonding and codependency in Batman and Robin stories as a form of subversive and covert psychological stimulation still ongoing. We will learn about the radical left social justice warrior roots of Superman and the ways entertainment media continues to politicize the youth, priming them for participation in false paradigms in adulthood. And we will reveal the Christian roots of Superman and Batman as Christ-Antichrist archetypes co-opted by a Jewish-dominated comics industry in service of inverting healthy paradigms in an age of toxic anti-hero, and how it relates to social activists like Antifa and Proud Boys of today. When I first heard of Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Frederick Wertham, I was a pretty big comic book fan, and I thought it was bullshit. It has been historically demonized by comic book fans, and it has been long forgotten by parents. Published more than 80 years ago, Dr. Frederick Wertham suggested that comic books were inspiring degenerate behavior amongst children. In the mid-1940s, the comic book was the most popular form of entertainment in America. Comics were selling between 80 million and 100 million copies every week, with a typical issue passed along or traded to 6 to 10 readers, thereby reaching more people than movies, television, radio, or magazines for adults. By 1952, more than 20 publishers were producing nearly 650 comics titles per month, employing well over 1,000 artists, writers, editors, letterers, and others. That's from the 10-Cent Plague by David Hadju. In hindsight, I can see there's some disturbing rewriting of history going on that is inverting a parental awakening. Now, due to popular Sunday newspaper comic strips, parents associated children's comic books with their tame cousins populated by innocent and humorous furry animals and goofy, fun-loving slapstick. After Dr. Frederick Wertham and others sounded the alarm, a full-fledged PR campaign was leveled against the parents and the doctors and communities waking up to the harmful messaging in the majority of comic books at the time, which are far different than comic books today, but there's still a subversive psychological manipulation going on. It was so severe, Dr. Frederick Wertham said, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book companies." Now, that might sound like hyperbole, but taken in context, Frederick Wertham was talking about an invasive social contagion that was destroying the core of family values by alienating children from their parents and society, and the juxtaposition of lurid sexual imagery that, by today's standards, seems maybe slightly risque, but was highly sexualized for the time, was put in the hands of children who were looking at gruesome graphic violence juxtaposed with sexual imagery, and many of these books were essentially textbooks for committing crime and delinquency. Comic books were larger for a while than television, movies, and magazines combined, and they were a window into another world. Seduction of the Innocent dealt with a disturbing trend that didn't fall out of the sky, but was engineered into comic book art, which was not given the same critical attention as other forms of entertainment, and went right under the nose of parents for decades before he sounded an alarm, and then there was a massive PR pushback. I want to take a look in hindsight and ask, was Dr. Frederick Wertham right about comic books? His 80-year-old warnings sound relative and prescient. Seduction of the Innocent is a book by American psychiatrist Frederick Wertham, published in 1954, that warned comic books were a negative form of popular literature and a serious case of juvenile delinquency. The book was taken seriously at the time in the United States and was a minor bestseller that created alarm in American parents and galvanized them to campaign for censorship. At the same time, a U.S. congressional inquiry was launched into the comic book industry. Subsequent to the publication of Seduction of the Innocent, the Comics Code Authority was voluntarily established by publishers to self-censor their titles. In the decades since the book's publication, Wertham's research has been disputed by scholars, and I find that to be alarming in the way in which his concerns are strawmanned and then bulldozed over by people who don't seem to care about what's happening to these kids. Young kids are looking for a leader. In the book, Dr. Wertham writes, contrary to the opinion of unprogressive, progressive educationalists, children like to be guided. When we as adults disappoint them by not giving them any worthy models to follow, we theorize that children resent authority. They do not. Actually, they have a natural need to be led and directed. The hyper-sexualized violence was of main concern for Wertham. Does comic book reading influence the sexual development of children? The question of sex education has been much discussed. Some preach almost unlimited openness and frankness, even at an early age. Others feel sex education must proceed very slowly, that it is best to begin with the birds and flowers. No correct answers can be given to such questions as, should sex instruction be given at home or in school? Because the questions are wrong. Children get it anyhow, and in both places. The problem is that what they get is so often wrong instruction. And even if nothing is said about sex, that is a form of sex instruction too. The greatest error is to think of sexual problems in isolation. They are a part of life. They influence other aspects of life, and are in turn themselves influenced. What I found interesting wasn't the dated language of this 80-year-old book, but that there's still an ongoing battle between proponents of free speech, who tend to be progressive liberals, and people who have kind of a common sense concern for children's well-being. One starting point for a discussion of sex education should be the fact that sex, in its subtle and crude aspects, often involves a great deal of mental anguish to children. They could often be spared such a painful preoccupations, worries, inferiority feelings, and guilt complexes as frequently occupy them. Education is not only the positive aspects of imparting knowledge, but also the preventative aspect of warding off harmful influences. If harmful influences are widespread in the population, a formal course of sex instruction separated from everything else can achieve little. Again, this doesn't sound so out of date. There still seems to be this war of ideas between people labeled liberal and progressive, who feel that teenage sexuality is a part of this sophisticated and evolving world we live in, and others who see incredibly impressionable minds being manipulated by a dangerous pop culture. So things haven't changed that much. Wertham goes on to write, pre-adolescence and adolescence are manifestly the most difficult periods in children's sexual development. This is so not only on account of the maturing of the sexual instinct, as it's commonly supposed, but also because of the awakening of social feelings at the time. All human beings have to learn a rationale of controlling, disciplining, and, if you will, sublimating sexual impulses. Only a decent social orientation can lead to a decent sex life, for practically all psychological sex problems are ethical problems. In sexual education, as in other education, one should also not forget that we are bringing children up not to be children, but to be adults. One of the most common criticisms I hear of these old school comic books, that is, serious criticism, is some of the overt and sometimes soft racism. Here we have Batman in a headdress. He and Robin are going to beat up some savages, so that's not going to fly today. But what we still have is the increasingly obvious codependent, trauma-bonded relationship with a disturbing grown-ass man who lives in a cave and keeps around a revolving door of teenagers. There's been several people that played Robin, so the most recent is Tim Drake. Here is Jason Todd as Robin in Batman 330, and he says that this woman is destroying you, and you won't admit it. Either she goes or I do. And Batman replies, "The door is that way, chum." So Robin is jealous of Batman's new working relationship with a sultry, grown-ass woman. Batman refers to Robin as chum. Chum is fish guts thrown in the water and used as bait for shark hunting. So he's literally calling this teenage boy in bikini bottoms with shaved legs bait. You're bait. Could that be jail bait? Could that be a curious choice of words there? I wonder if it's unconscious or intentionally subversive. Now let's talk about cause and effect, because maybe Batman there is displaying a little bisexuality. He's traded in the jailbait for a grown woman. Meanwhile, very recently, not too long ago, Tim Drake as Robin comes out as bisexual. Batman is basically a sugar daddy figure who's adopted a teenage boy who's been traumatized by the death of his parents, and Batman keeps him in a kind of controlled, trauma-bonding, codependent, disturbing relationship. And why he needs to constantly be in his underwear and share a bed with Batman, and often is depicted as rather effeminate or on the cusp of puberty and manhood, but he's still sleeping with Batman, literally. And they get naked together. The gay community absolutely loves this, by the way.
As of yesterday, there's a new LGBTQ plus superhero on the block, but DC Comics readers already know him well. The latest issue of Batman Urban Legends, a monthly anthology series, revealed that the Caped Crusader's longtime sidekick, Robin, specifically the Tim Drake version of him, is, well, bisexual. The moment came at the end of part 3 of the Sum of Our Parts, I love that title, story from writer Megan Fitzmartin, artist Bailyn Ortega, colorist Alejandro Sanchez, and letterer Pat Brousseau. Robin joins other LGBTQ plus characters that came out recently, like Batwoman and Loki.
Tim Drake or not, he's 81 years old and he just came out. See, you're never too old to come out and be queer.
The gay haircut, the strong jawline, the cheekbones, flawless.
Chris O'Donnell, Robin, nipples on his shoot. We became bisexual for him too, so it only makes sense he would be.
Right?
I knew it from the moment that my brother made me play Robin during his Batman and Robin episodes.
Holy hole, Batman!
So speaking of delayed puberty, or permanent adolescence, the maturity level there is at an all-time low. We've got a couple men that appear to be at least in their early 50s talking about sex with teenagers. We've got some not so coded allusions to sex with Robin and Batman. I'd like to point out that one of these men here, the bald guy with the glasses, he's making references to how sexy a teenager is. If that were a straight man of the same age, the same exact guy, and he were saying this about a young woman the same age, it would be universally condemned as inappropriate and at the very least labeled creepy. But here he is mentioning Robin's gay haircut, and I think that's an interesting example of a double standard within the gay community. Gay people are allowed to say someone's outfit or, oh my God, his haircut, he's super gay. That's so gay. And when they say that, you just say, oh, that's, one gay person recognizing another. If a straight person were to point out that Chris O'Donnell as Robin in the Batman film, Batman and Robin, appears very gay, well, that's actually homophobia, right? There's something wrong with you if you point out the obvious. But a gay person can point it out, and that's fine. I'd also like to point out that sharks smell blood. So we've got a negative female stereotype here with this cover of Batman where he's calling Robin chum. Essentially the female is bad news for him and Robin. We got to keep the female away. So, and there's jokes about that in Joel Schumacher's epically bad Batman and Robin movie.
And you are?
Batgirl.
That's not awfully PC. What about Bat Person?
Found the Batcave.
She knows who we are.
Guess we'll just have to kill her.
So take a look at the predictive programming in this Joel Schumacher Batman movie in the form of inverted paradigms. We have a cold as ice bitch in the form of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's got a codpiece and fake silicon blue tits there. It's kind of ridiculous, and he's going to freeze the world to death. And we also have a second bad guy in the form of Batgirl, and this is Uma Thurman. She wants to kill the bill. She wants the right to have another abortion and not care about it. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, like he has been typecast in the past, is going to give birth. And this woman is just simply toxic femininity.
Poison ivy.
There's an interesting pattern I'll go into in the next installment of this series on comics. But suffice it to say, you become that which you hate. So you will see that time and time again in a lot of media, not just comic book media. Homosexuality in the Batman franchise has its own Wikipedia page. The Joel Schumacher films get their own special annotations here. Slate magazine called Schumacher's Batman films defiantly queer with a sugar daddy Batman and a rough trade Robin. It made fun of the codpiece and bat nipples. George Clooney said that Joel Schumacher told me we never made another Batman film because Batman was gay. Barbara Walters asked George Clooney, George, is Batman gay? And Clooney says, he isn't, but I made him gay. I could have played Batman straight, but I made him gay. In other words, the bad man, or the Batman, he's kind of like Eminem and Marilyn Manson. He is whatever you say he is. So whatever you don't want, you get more of that. So in this sense, we've got a film where basically evil is represented by global freezing and toxic femininity. And if we get more of what we hate, and we hate global freezing and toxic femininity, maybe that's kind of like an antidote. Maybe we need another gay Batman movie. Take the piss out of this ridiculous paradigm we're living under. Or perhaps this is kind of an inversion in which we don't take global freezing seriously, and we don't take toxic femininity seriously, and therefore we don't get more of them, we get more of the opposite. I don't know. I'm just riffing here. Anyway, moving on. So I want to go back to that idea of Batgirl as Bat Person. We're eliminating the girl. So there's kind of a precognition of the gender wars ahead of time in the 90s Batman movies from Joel Schumacher. Many gay men find female anatomy disgusting. And the ins and outs, no pun intended, of the female reproductive system are seen as absolutely gross. The irony from guys that use the back door find women gross, that's pretty funny. Nonetheless, that's embedded with the chum reference and the Shark Week. Let's take a look at, well, this is just one example where Robin is spread eagle in his underwear or bikini bottoms. But I want to unpack some subtle symbolism here. Historically, Robin's little bikini briefs, well, first off, you'll notice he's built like an action figure in that it doesn't look like he actually has male anatomy down there. There's no discernible, noticeable male anatomy. We do have these kind of fish scale-like designs on his underwear. So when I think of the fish scale, I think of Vesica Pisces fish symbol, and that kind of reminds me of a cigar cutter, not something you want down there.
To perform a straight cut, pretty cut and dry. Pun intended. You're going to want to take your cigar, you're going to place it through the cutter, line your cigar up, make sure it's 90 degrees from the cutting surface so you're getting a good straight cut. Watch where the blades are at to make sure you're only right there below that cap, still up on the shoulder so you're not overcutting, and then you're just going to snip. Just removing the very top cap of the cigar to allow air to flow through it.
So the fish symbol looks like a cigar cutter. That's one thing I think of. I also see the term for Hummer, a Hummer. Not the military vehicle, the SUV, but the colloquialism referring to a blowjob, oral sex. So the hummingbird also has this kind of scaled pattern. Kind of looks like nanotech there on that ruby-throated hummingbird. Those are beautiful birds. But when I see this pattern as someone who's into birding, I think that looks like fish scales, or that looks like the throat of a hummingbird. So when I think of the throat and the hummingbird, that's a Hummer. That's, yeah, so we got cigar cutters and Hummers. Now, this isn't like a film in which someone took a freeze frame and is trying to suggest something is meant to be something else. The artists that depict this do it on purpose. This isn't a freeze frame where Robin just happens to have his face up some guy's butt crack. That's a single drawing. It's not a series of events that are frozen in time. You know how you could freeze someone while they're talking and make their face look awkward, but that's not what the person filming the speech would want? Well, that's not what we have here. Now let's go back to this idea of the teenageification of a nation. We have perpetual emotional adolescence also manifesting in the physical. We have psychological and physical puberty blockers these days. So a couple years ago, Disney purchased Marvel. So the Marvel comic books and all the characters are now property of Disney. And this has become a business in which we've got stuff formerly for kids, now often rated R. The Avengers are officially, I think the Avengers Endgame is officially now the most profitable money-making film of all time. It broke the Avatar record, which broke the record for Titanic, which broke the record for, I don't know, E.T. or something like that. And we have an age of the anti-hero in which heroes save the day by basically focusing on vengeance. I mean, that's embedded in the name Avengers. I never cared for the Avengers comics. I thought they were kind of lame. I was more into the X-Men. But we get the same paradigms. The Dark Phoenix and the Apocalypse storyline is in the X-Men. It's done very poorly in the Fantastic Four movies. And I thought the Avengers movies, some of those were very well done. However, we have to ask ourselves, well, we don't have to, but I like to ask myself, what am I worshiping when I enjoy these movies? What is it that I like about them? And what do I not like? We have trauma bonding with Sugar Daddy. This is when, well, it sounds preposterous, but the truth sometimes is stranger than fiction. Trauma bonds, also referred to as traumatic bonds, are emotional bonds with an individual and sometimes with a group that arise from a recurring cyclical pattern of abuse, perpetuated by intermittent reinforcement through rewards and punishments. The process of forming trauma bonds is referred to as trauma bonding or traumatic bonding. A trauma bond is usually involves a victim and a perpetrator in a unidirectional relationship wherein the victim forms an emotional bond with the perpetrator. This can also be conceptualized as a dominated dominator or abusive or abuser dynamic. And in this sense, Batman scouts damaged boys in the form of Robin. Robin has been, in the comics and movies, understood to be several different people. I believe it's maybe Tim Drake is Robin right now. I'm not sure what the last one was. I think his name was Jason Todd, but I'm not positive. But there's been several. There's only one Batman, Bruce Wayne, but Bruce Wayne keeps going through different Robins. He scouts these boys who have a serious trauma and then adopts them and takes them to the Batcave and puts them in colorful underwear and then takes them out at night. So you could see a pattern here is not entirely unlike a kind of like a sugar daddy who takes kids out to the nightclub. You got a rich guy who's basically buying you fancy, colorful outfits and taking you out to the gay bars and treating you to the life. And maybe they're traumatized by their childhood because, you know, in the real world representation, not the superhero world, but this maps onto the real world in that you've got young, alienated, homosexual men who are either closeted or ostracized from their family. Robin here is scouted by Bruce Wayne, played by Val Kilmer, who's also portrayed the Lizard King, Jim Morrison, as well as Simon Templar, the Saint, looking for cold fusion. We'll get into that. I also wanted to point out that this big cartoony bomb that Robin is throwing into the Gotham Bay, when he gets it out of the hole, it's got LOO on there. The 007 is an LOO. That's Lou. Lou is British slang for the bathroom. So we've got James Bond, Mission Impossible, 007. There's also a bit of Sisyphus symbolism. He's in Greek mythology, pushing this boulder up a hill forever in hell for tricking the gods and dying and then playing a trick on the gods so he gets to go back and live another life. And Captain America does that symbolically in the Avengers movies. But he tricks the other guy. He gives him the shield and he's like, here, this is your problem now. So he kind of schleps the boulder off on somebody else and then goes and lives a long life with his wife back in the 40s and 50s. So, yeah, that was kind of that was a cruel joke that looks like he gave this dude a kind of a boost. So we've got Robin here. His parents are flightless birds that fall to their death while he rises to the occasion and gives a shit or takes a shit or throws this big turd from the loo out into the bay. And that's also symbolically a cherry bomb getting thrown in the toilet. There's some dick and fart jokes in here. There's dick and fart jokes throughout comic book history. In fact, all of mythology I've come across, from Greek mythology to the New Testament to Batman and Robin to modern day TV shows, they're absolutely littered with dick and fart jokes. So someone's co-creative faculty has a puerile teenage sense of humor. So we've got the 007. When it's flipped, it looks like LOO. That's bathroom. The bomb is bright and red when it falls into the harbor. It looks black, but once we see it drop in the water, it's got a little split in it too. It looks like a piece of fruit. And I think a cherry bomb's M80's getting thrown in the toilet. And when it explodes, it looks like a jack-o'-lantern or a smashing pumpkin. So this is the greatest day of his life. His flightless bird parents, who aren't like him, die, and he's liberated and he saves the day, and now he's going to go take off with Bruce Wayne. They're going to go through the back door into the Batcave, and he's going to get a cool S&M costume. Right? Do you see how that works? How is Batman's costume not just a funky S&M gear? So he's into torturing himself and other people. There's also some atomic symbolism here. Check this out. So I believe I mentioned this family symbolism in the structure of the atom in my Carbon 666 video. We see here the father, mother, and son as proton, electron, and neutron. And we have the character of Robin, who rose above that configuration to save the day. So he would manifest here symbolically as radiation, as an electron or a proton or neutron for that matter, that made it out of the atom. So that would be symbolically radiation. That's where many superheroes get their superpower. If you remember, Hulk was exposed to gamma rays. there was some strange radiation in outer space that gave the Fantastic Four their abilities or deformities, depending on how you look at it. And then we have Peter Parker bitten by a radioactive spider, and that gives him his powers as Spider-Man. There's some interesting symbolism in Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man film, which kicked off this new generation of big-budget blockbuster superhero films. This was before Disney bought out Marvel, so these are Sony pictures. We have here the kind of perennial baby-faced actor portraying Peter Parker, who wakes up after going through a transformation. You can see here with his hipster nerd glasses and his kind of boyish cut, he actually looks a little bit like a lesbian girl. And we can see in the background, you'll notice there's a poster on his wall that says inversion. So we have yet another symbolic inversion similar to that Joel Schumacher film. So we got Peter Parker here looking at his small pectoral muscles. In that particular scene there, it looks a little bit more like he's got some new A cups. So he's impressed with his new breasts, basically. He's going through some changes. Uncle Ben will later make a reference to teenagers and their raging hormones. There's also a little voyeurism here. He's watching Mary Jane get ready for school across the way through the window. And that window pane covers her breasts, so there's a little bit of a pain in the ass symbolism there. He wishes he could see more of her. When he comes downstairs, he's dancing along the wall there. He looks kind of like Fred Astaire. It's a little bit more homosexual, theatrical, musical symbolism. So that maps onto what's going on with the Joel Schumacher gay Batman and Robin movies as well. There's a relationship here that's awful close between Uncle Ben and Peter Parker, and we see Uncle Ben talking about teenager hormones, and then he's eating some sausages.
Teenagers. Raging hormones, they never change.
Any one of those symbols would be uneventful, but when you combine them, there's some subtle stuff going on here. That maps onto today's paradigms of teenagers being conflicted with a social contagion that they get from the internet, and they want to change their DNA and undergo some magic shot that's going to give them superpowers. So we could see here, it looks like Toby Parker, or what's his name? Toby Maguire. Looks like he went under some human growth hormone treatment. So again, something happens to him and overnight he's now hyper masculine compared to his nerdy self. So this is symbolically the teenagers getting some sort of shot or treatment, going through a change or a transition. And we see that poster on the wall that says inversion. And the way he's longingly looking out the window at a rather feminine figure in the form of Mary Jane, who has some prominent breasts featured in that shot there. We could see this with the sound off, as if Toby Parker here, or Toby Maguire, Peter Parker, wants to be something he isn't. Or something happened to him and now magically he's singing and dancing like Fred Astaire. So homosexual undertones as well as transgender overtones abound. That's just a taste of it. If we go back to that Joel Schumacher scene with Robin's parents dying, you'll see that he's up in the rafters and they prominently feature these spider webs all over the place as he's crawling through the rafters. So there's a little bit of a symbolic nod that Robin and Peter Parker are kind of the same prototype or the same symbol. And again, we have the dead family in Uncle Ben, and Peter doesn't have his parents around. So again, we have superheroes like Tony Stark taking an interest in Peter Parker, and Bruce Wayne shopping around as a creepy S&M geared out sugar daddy with an endless litany of different troubled teenagers hanging out with him in his Batcave. And then we have Val Kilmer as Bruce Wayne. In part 2, I'll go into his role as the Lizard King, and Simon Templar, the Saint.